My name is Nia, 34 years old. Just days after burying my husband, I thought grief was the worst pain I would ever endure. Then my mother-in-law cruelly threw me and my 6-year-old daughter out into the streets. But she had no idea who the true owner of the house she was living in really was. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The heavy scent of fried chicken, baked macaroni and cheese, and pound cake still lingered in the air of my South Fulton estate. The repast had just ended. For the past 4 hours, my home had been filled with members of my mother-in-law, Beatrice's church congregation, and her exclusive social clubs. They had walked through my front doors, wearing their black dresses and wide-brimmed hats, offering me hollow condolences while their eyes scanned the custom crown molding and the imported marble countertops. They whispered in the corners of my dining room, casting side glances at me while loudly praising Beatrice for her strength. Through it all, I maintained my composure. I smiled politely. I thanked them for their prayers. I did it all to honor the memory of my late husband Jamal, who had been taken from us in a sudden car accident just 1 week prior. The moment the last guest walked out the door, the performative sympathy evaporated completely. The massive house fell into a deafening silence. I was exhausted to my very bones. I walked up the sweeping grand staircase and made my way into my 6-year-old daughter Maya's bedroom. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She did not fully understand why her father was never coming back, but she understood the devastating finality of the wooden casket we had watched being lowered into the ground. I laid beside her in her small bed, stroking her natural curls, singing soft lullabies until her breathing finally slowed into a deep sleep. I gently pulled the blanket over her shoulders and quietly stepped out of her room, craving nothing but a hot shower and a moment to finally break down and cry in private. But as my foot hit the top step of the staircase, a loud, violent crash echoed from the living room below. It was the distinct sound of something heavy hitting the custom hardwood floors. I rushed down the stairs, my heart pounding against my ribs, thinking an intruder had broken into the house. Instead, I found Beatrice standing in the center of the living room. She was still wearing her impeccable black funeral suit, her pearls resting perfectly against her chest, but her face was twisted into a mask of absolute disgust. At her feet lay 2 large black trash bags. One of them had split open, spilling my clothes, my shoes, and my personal toiletries across the polished floor. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the scattered garments. For a second, my exhausted brain could not process what I was seeing. I looked from the trash bags up to the woman who was supposed to be my family. "What are you doing?" I asked, keeping my voice low so I would not wake Maya. Beatrice crossed her arms over her chest, her posture rigid with superiority. "The funeral is over, Nia. The guests have gone home. My tolerance for your presence in this family died the moment my son took his last breath. You are packing up your little brat and getting out of my house tonight." I took a step forward, utterly bewildered by the sheer audacity of her statement. "Beatrice, you just buried your son today. I just buried my husband. Maya just buried her father. What kind of heartless game are you playing right now?" "This is no game!" Beatrice snapped back, her voice raising in volume. "This house belongs to the family legacy. It belongs to the bloodline. You were nothing but a temporary fixture here because my son had a soft spot for charity cases. Now that he is gone, your free ride is officially over. Hand over the keys, Nia. I want you off this property before midnight." I looked at this woman, a woman who prided herself on her Christian values and her high society image, standing in my living room and ordering me out like a stray dog. A surge of protective anger flared in my chest, but I forced it down. I had learned early in my marriage that showing raw emotion to Beatrice was like handing a loaded weapon to a sociopath. She thrived on making people lose control, so she could brand them as unstable. I refused to give her that satisfaction. "This is my home, Beatrice," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. "Jamal and I lived here together. You do not have the authority to throw me out of anywhere, let alone the house where my daughter sleeps upstairs." Beatrice let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "Your home, Please, do not insult my intelligence. We all know you are just a low-level accountant pulling spreadsheets at some mediocre firm. You could not afford the property taxes on this South Fulton estate in your wildest dreams, let alone the mortgage. Jamal carried you financially from the day you managed to trap him with a pregnancy. He bought this house. He paid for this lifestyle. You just got to play pretend because you married a successful orthopedic surgeon. She took a step closer to me, pointing a manicured finger in my face. You brought nothing to this marriage but student loan debt and a lack of pedigree. You do not belong in our world. You never did. I told Jamal you were a gold digger from the start, but he was too blinded by his own good heart to see it. Well, his heart is not here to protect you anymore. I stared at her finger, resisting the overwhelming urge to break it. The sheer delusion of her narrative was staggering. She truly believed that because I dressed simply and kept a quiet profile, I was completely dependent on her son. She equated my humble demeanor with financial poverty. She had no idea that my job as a low-level accountant was a carefully constructed cover story. She had no idea that I was actually a senior wealth manager and CEO of a private equity firm managing portfolios worth tens of millions of dollars. Jamal and I had deliberately kept my true career and financial status a secret. We knew exactly how greedy and entitled Beatrice and the rest of his family were. If they had known I possessed that level of wealth, they would have relentlessly harassed us for business investments, luxury cars, and debt bailouts. But I could not reveal my hidden ace just yet. If I laid my cards on the table now, she would change her strategy. I needed her to fully commit to her cruelty so I could destroy her completely when the time was right. I am not leaving this house tonight, I stated firmly, standing my ground. Maya is asleep. You can take your trash bags, pack up your own delusions, and go back to whichever hole you crawled out of. If you try to physically remove me or my daughter, I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. Beatrice did not flinch. Instead, a wicked, triumphant smirk spread across her face. She looked past me toward the darkened, formal dining room. "Oh, you will not be calling the police, honey," Beatrice said, her tone dripping with venomous satisfaction, "because the police will side with the legal owners of the property, and you are not one of them." Footsteps echoed from the shadows of the formal dining room. Out stepped my sister-in-law Chantel, followed closely by her husband Darius. Chantel had always been the golden child of the family, a woman who measured her worth by the designer labels she wore and the luxury cars she leased. Darius was a man who constantly bragged about being a crypto investor and a serial entrepreneur, though he had never held a steady job and was drowning in debt. They moved into the light of the living room, both wearing matching expressions of smug superiority. Darius was holding a thick manila folder. He strutted over to the large marble kitchen island and dramatically threw the folder down onto the pristine surface. "You heard," the matriarch Darius said, puffing out his chest to look more intimidating than he actually was. "Time to pack it up, Nia. The squatter era is officially over." I crossed my arms, maintaining my cold exterior, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "And what exactly is that supposed to be?" I asked, nodding toward the folder on the island. Chantel walked over, picked up the folder, and pulled out a stack of documents stapled together with a blue legal backing. She held it up like a trophy. "This is my brother's last will and testament." Chantel sneered, her eyes gleaming with malice. "You really thought Jamal was as stupid as you hoped he was. You thought he was just going to leave his hard-earned money to a woman who contributed absolutely nothing to his empire." She stepped closer, waving the papers in my direction. "Jamal knew exactly what you were. He confided in me months ago. He knew you were just waiting for a chance to cash in on his life insurance and take his property. That is why he went to a lawyer and drafted a new will. It states clearly that his entire estate, his life insurance policies, his investment accounts, and this beautiful house are to be left solely to our mother. You and that little girl get absolutely nothing." The audacity of her lie was so massive it almost knocked the wind out of me. Jamal loved Maya more than life itself. He was a fiercely devoted father and a fiercely loyal husband. The idea that he would secretly disinherit his own daughter and leave his wealth to a mother who constantly demanded money from him was medically, logically, and fundamentally impossible. "Let me see that," I demanded, holding out my hand. Chantel hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing at Darius before thrusting the document into my hand. Go ahead and read it. Weep over it for all I care. It is notarized, filed, and completely legal. You are officially trespassing on my mother's property. I took the document and flipped to the last page. My eyes immediately locked onto the signature line. There, written in black ink, was the name Jamal Marcus Brooks. To the untrained eye, it looked convincing. It had the same general slant and the same aggressive underline that Jamal used when he signed restaurant receipts. But to a woman who had scrutinized financial documents and legal contracts for a living, the forgery was glaringly obvious. Jamal was a surgeon. He had a very specific, rapid way of signing his name born from years of hastily signing medical charts. When he wrote the letter J, the bottom loop always hooked sharply to the left, almost cutting through the letter itself. The signature on this supposed will had a smooth, perfectly rounded loop that swooped to the right. It was a careful, deliberate tracing. Someone had taken their time trying to copy his signature, which completely destroyed the natural velocity of his actual handwriting. Furthermore, the notary stamp belonged to a man named Kevin Vance, a shady associate of Darius, who had previously lost his real estate license for fraudulent activities. They had actually done it. They had forged a legal document to steal an estate from a grieving widow and a fatherless child. My heart hammered against my ribs, not out of fear, but out of a dark, profound realization. They had just handed me the very rope I would use to hang them. Forging a will to claim assets was a serious crime, but using it to assert ownership of an estate they knew nothing about was a fatal mistake. They had no idea that Jamal did not even own this house. They were trying to lay claim to an illusion. I looked up from the forged signature. Beatrice, Chantel, and Darius were watching me like vultures waiting for a carcass to drop. They expected me to scream. They expected me to break down crying, to drop to my knees and beg for mercy. They wanted me to plead for a place to stay so they could relish the power of denying me. Instead, I slowly closed the folder and placed it neatly back onto the marble island. I looked directly into Beatrice's eyes, and I smiled. It was an icy, terrifying smile that caused the triumphant smirk on her face to falter for just a second. You know what I said? My voice smooth and perfectly steady. You can have it. Chantel blinked in confusion. What did you say? I said you can have it, I repeated, turning to face all three of them. You want the house, keep it. You want the clothes in those trash bags, donate them or burn them. I do not care. I am not going to stand here and fight over bricks and mortar with people who would stoop this low on the day we buried a man we all supposedly loved. Darius puffed his chest out again, trying to regain the upper hand. Good. Glad you finally understand your place. Leave the house keys on the counter. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy set of keys, and dropped them onto the marble island. They landed with a loud metallic clatter that echoed through the kitchen. Consider it yours, I said softly. I hope it brings you everything you deserve. Without waiting for another word, I turned my back on them and walked calmly up the stairs. I entered Maya's room, gently scooped my sleeping daughter into my arms, and grabbed her small backpack of favorite toys. She stirred slightly, resting her head against my shoulder, as I carried her out of the room and back down the grand staircase. Beatrice, Chantel, and Darius were still standing in the living room watching me with a mixture of suspicion and glee. They could not believe how easy it had been. They thought they had broken my spirit. They thought I was walking out into the cold Atlanta night with absolutely nothing, destined to sleep in a cheap motel or on a friend's couch. I walked out the front door without looking back. I did not shed a single tear. I buckled Maya securely into the back seat of my SUV, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the long, winding driveway of the South Fulton estate, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The exterior lights of the massive house were blazing, illuminating the property they thought they had just conquered. I picked up my phone and dialed my private attorney's emergency number. It rang twice before he answered. Marcus. I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. It is Nia. The bait has been taken. They produced the forged will and kicked me out of the house. I heard the scratch of a pen on the other end of the line. Understood, Marcus replied professionally. Are you and Maya safe? We are fine, I assured him. We are heading to the penthouse now. I need you to initiate phase 2. Let them believe they have full control of the property. Do not block any inquiries they make to the county clerk. Let them dig the hole as deep as they possibly can. Consider it done, Marcus said. I hung up the phone and merged onto the highway, driving away from the House of Lies. They had chosen to declare war on a woman they thought was a helpless victim. They had chosen to steal from a child. They had no idea that they had just stolen a house that belonged to my corporation, and I was going to let federal law bury them alive. As I drove down the interstate, my phone vibrated relentlessly in the cup holder. A stream of notifications poured in. The family group chat was exploding. I pulled into a well-lit plaza parking lot to check the messages, needing to see how quickly Beatrice and Chantel were moving to control the narrative. I opened the messages and read the vitriol they had spun. Chantel sent a massive paragraph to aunts, uncles, and cousins. She claimed that after the repast, I threw a hysterical fit, demanded all the cash from the funeral donation envelopes, and stormed out. Beatrice followed with a dramatic performance, stating she was heartbroken and that I abandoned the family in our darkest hour. She painted me as a manipulative, unstable woman who took the money and ran, leaving her to grieve alone. It did not stop with private messages. I opened Facebook and saw Beatrice posted a long, tearful update. She wrote how a mother's pain of losing a son was compounded by a greedy daughter-in-law who cared more about cashing out than honoring her husband's memory. She asked her church congregation for prayers, claiming she was fighting to keep a roof over her head because I supposedly drained Jamal's emergency funds before vanishing. The comments were flooded with sympathy for her and sheer outrage directed at me. People who hugged me hours ago were now calling me a gold digger, a thief, and an unfit mother. They were working overtime to build a public defense. By making me the villain who ran away with stolen money, they preemptively explained my sudden absence from the South Fulton estate. They laid the groundwork to play the victims when people inevitably asked why Jamal's widow was no longer living in his house. The sheer audacity of their lies would have crushed the old me. Years ago, I would have frantically replied to the group chat, defending myself, crying, and begging the extended family to believe the truth. But tonight, I just locked my phone screen and tossed it onto the passenger seat. Their smear campaign meant nothing to me. Let them have their digital sympathy. I put the car back into gear and headed toward the city center. 20 minutes later, I turned off the busy streets of Buckhead and approached the heavily guarded entrance of the Sovereign, one of the most exclusive luxury high-rises in Atlanta. The iron gate slowly parted as the automated license plate reader recognized my vehicle. I drove down into the underground parking garage and pulled into my reserved VIP spot near the private elevators. I turned off the engine and gently unbuckled Maya from her car seat. She was still fast asleep, exhausted from the emotional toll of the day. I hoisted her onto my hip, grabbed her small backpack, and walked over to the secure elevator bank. I pulled a sleek black key fob from my purse and pressed it against the biometric scanner. A soft chime echoed, and the brushed steel doors slid open immediately. This elevator had no buttons for specific floors. It was programmed to recognize my fob and take me directly to my private residence. The doors closed and the elevator shot upward smoothly, bypassing the standard condos and heading straight for the top. When the doors parted again, we did not step out into a hallway. We stepped directly into the grand foyer of a stunning multi-million-dollar penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire living space, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. The city lights glittered like a sea of diamonds below us. The interior was a masterpiece of modern design, featuring imported Italian marble floors, custom modern art pieces, and a sweeping floating staircase leading to the second level. I walked past the massive chef's kitchen and carried Maya down the hallway into a bedroom that had been designed specifically for her. It was painted in soft lavender, her favorite color, and filled with plush toys, a canopy bed, and a wall-sized mural of a tranquil forest. I laid her down, gently pulled the custom duvet over her, and kissed her forehead. She stirred slightly, murmured a soft sound, and settled back into a peaceful sleep. She was safe. We were completely insulated from the toxic chaos happening miles away in South Fulton. I walked into the main living area, poured a glass of sparkling water, and stood looking out over the city. This penthouse was my true domain. The narrative that Beatrice and Chantel so desperately believed that I was a low-level struggling accountant who needed Jamal to survive was the greatest illusion I had ever orchestrated. I was not a basic accountant. I was a senior wealth manager and the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, a highly successful private equity firm. I managed diversified portfolios for high-net-worth individuals, handled aggressive corporate acquisitions, and controlled assets totaling in the hundreds of millions. I built my empire from the ground up through ruthless business acumen and sharp financial strategies. Jamal was the only person in his family who knew the absolute truth about my career and my wealth. I still vividly remember the night I finally told him. We had been dating for a year, and things were getting serious. I sat him down in this penthouse, poured wine, and handed him my corporate portfolio. I expected him to be intimidated or insecure as many men are when confronted with a woman who vastly out-earns them. Instead, Jamal burst into a huge, joyous laugh, picked me up and spun me around the room. He was incredibly proud of me. But that same night, Jamal and I made a solemn binding agreement. We decided to keep my wealth completely hidden from his family. Jamal loved his mother and sister, but he was not blind to their toxic flaws. Beatrice was a woman consumed by status and greed. She had drained Jamal's father of every penny before their divorce, and she had spent the last decade treating Jamal like her personal ATM. If she needed a new luxury car to show off at church, she guilt-tripped Jamal into paying the lease. If she wanted to go on a cruise with her friends, she cried about her blood pressure until Jamal covered the cost. Chantel was exactly the same. Enabled by Beatrice's conditioning, she felt entitled to the best of everything without putting in a day of hard work. And then she married Darius. Darius was a walking financial disaster. He called himself a crypto investor and a visionary entrepreneur, but his entire career consisted of launching shady business schemes, losing money, and begging for bailouts. Jamal had bailed Darius out of 2 legal disputes related to unpaid business loans before finally cutting him off. Jamal and I knew that if Beatrice, Chantel, or Darius ever found out I was a CEO with massive financial resources, they would never leave us alone. They would demand investments in Darius's fake companies. They would expect me to fund their extravagant lifestyles. They would use family guilt and emotional manipulation to drain my accounts just as they had tried to drain Jamal's. To protect our peace, our marriage, and our future daughter's inheritance, we crafted the perfect cover story. I became Nia, the quiet, humble, low-level accountant who made a modest salary and relied on her brilliant surgeon husband. It was a role I played flawlessly for years. I wore simple clothes to family gatherings. I drove a reliable mid-range SUV instead of the luxury sports cars I actually owned. I let Beatrice insult my simple tastes. I let Chantel mock my lack of designer handbags. I smiled politely and nodded when Darius tried to lecture me about finance, ignoring the fact that I could have legally dismantled his entire portfolio before my morning coffee. I swallowed my pride because it kept my husband happy and the financial vultures at a safe distance. But Jamal was gone now. The man who had served as the buffer between me and their insatiable greed was no longer here to protect them from me. By kicking me out of the house and forging his will, they had broken the only treaty that kept them safe. They thought they outsmarted a defenseless widow. They thought they were playing checkers with a woman who did not even know the rules of the game. They had no idea they had just declared war on a corporate shark who played high-stakes chess for a living. I stood by the window, watching the taillights of cars moving on the highway far below. Let them have their victory lap on Facebook. Let them spin their lies in the group chat. and gather sympathy from their clueless friends. Their entire reality was built on a fragile house of cards funded by a man who was no longer there to pay the debts and sitting on property they did not actually own. I finished my water, placed the glass on the marble counter, and walked to my home office. It was time to get to work. I powered on my desktop, instantly bypassing the encrypted firewall. I began organizing the specific legal documents that would ensure their complete and total destruction. The next morning arrived with a crisp clarity. I sat in the center of my executive suite at Vanguard Holdings, the panoramic glass walls, offering an unobstructed view of the bustling Atlanta financial district below. My mahogany desk held only an encrypted laptop and black coffee. I had already dropped Maya off at her elite private academy, ensuring she was completely shielded from the poisonous drama unfolding across town. Here in my corporate fortress, I was not the grieving discarded widow Beatrice and Chantel were currently dragging through the mud on social media. I was a very patient predator surveying the landscape. My secure phone vibrated against the polished wood of my desk. The caller ID flashed the name Darius. I did not reach for it. I simply watched the screen light up, letting the device buzz until it finally clicked over to voicemail. I took a slow sip of my coffee, waiting for the notification icon to appear. A minute later, the red recording symbol popped up on my screen. I clicked play and leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, letting the audio fill the silent expanse of my office. "You listen to me." Nia Darius began, his voice thick with a fake bravado that barely masked his underlying cowardice. "Do not even think about showing your face at Mount Zion Baptist this Sunday. Beatrice has been through enough trauma without you parading your pathetic self down the aisles trying to scrounge up pity from the congregation. You are a disgrace to this family, and we have already told everyone the truth about how you tried to rob a grieving mother blind. If you show up, I will personally have the deacons escort you out to the curb where you belong. You chose to walk away with nothing, and that is exactly what you are going to get. Nothing." He paused, and I could hear the distinct sound of ice clinking in a glass. He was drinking at 10 in the morning, celebrating a victory he had not actually won. "And just so you know how totally out of your league you are," he continued, his tone shifting into pure, unadulterated gloating, "I have already taken care of the estate. Since Jamal left everything to Beatrice in that airtight, will she officially appointed me as the financial manager of the family assets. We did not waste any time, Nia. I took that will straight to the bank this morning and initiated a home equity line of credit on the South Fulton house. $500,000, Nia. $500,000 in liquid cash is hitting my accounts by the end of the week. I am finally funding my decentralized finance startup, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop me. You should have played nice. Maybe I would have tossed you a few crumbs to pay your rent. Stay away from the church, stay away from us, and enjoy whatever miserable hole you crawled into." The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I sat perfectly still in the quiet of my office. For a brief second, I actually felt a twinge of second-hand embarrassment for the sheer staggering magnitude of his stupidity. Darius was a man who watched a few online videos about cryptocurrency and suddenly believed he was a financial genius. He was so blindingly arrogant that he did not even understand the basic mechanics of real estate law, let alone the severe federal regulations governing bank loans. He genuinely believed that walking into a local bank branch with a poorly forged document was the ultimate checkmate. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he had secured his future. Instead, he had just confessed to a federal crime on a recorded line. I plugged my phone into my computer and securely extracted the audio file, saving it to a heavily encrypted offshore server with multiple backups. That 3-minute monologue was the most valuable asset I possessed. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the direct line to Marcus, my private attorney, and one of the most ruthless corporate litigators in the state of Georgia. He answered on the first ring. "Marcus." I said, my voice crisp and authoritative. "The rats have officially taken the cheese. They took the forged will to a lender and initiated a HELOC for $500,000 against the South Fulton property." The silence on the other end of the line was palpable. I could hear Marcus shifting in his chair. Are you absolutely certain? He asked, his professional tone edged with disbelief. Initiating a loan of that size on a property using fraudulent documents is not just a civil matter, Naya. That is felony bank fraud. It is wire fraud if the funds cross state lines. It is an absolute legal nightmare. I am entirely certain, I replied, staring out at the city skyline. Darius just left me a highly detailed voicemail bragging about the entire scheme. He explicitly named the amount, the property, and his intention to funnel the money into a fake corporate entity. He handed us the smoking gun on a silver platter. I just sent the audio file to your secure inbox. I heard the clicking of a keyboard as Marcus opened the file. A few minutes passed while he listened to Darius's arrogant rant. When Marcus spoke again, he sounded almost giddy with legal anticipation. This is incredible, Marcus said. The sheer incompetence is actually breathtaking. He is leveraging an asset that your corporation owns entirely. Because the house is held in a blind trust controlled by Vanguard Holdings, any title search the bank performs will show a corporate entity, not Jamal's personal estate. But if Darius is using a corrupt notary and a shady loan officer, which we know he has in his network, they might push the preliminary approval through by falsifying the title documents. I will contact the bank's fraud department immediately. We can freeze the transaction before the funds are dispersed and have the local authorities arrest him by tomorrow afternoon. No! I commanded, my voice cutting through his excitement like a blade. Do not block the transaction. Let the approval process proceed without any interference from our end. Marcus paused, clearly thrown off by my instruction. Nia, if we let the bank disperse $500,000 to him, the legal unwinding process becomes significantly more complicated. Why would we allow him to actually acquire the funds? Because attempted fraud is a slap on the wrist for a man like Darius, I explained, leaning closer to the phone. He would cry ignorance. He would blame the corrupt notary. He would claim Beatrice manipulated him and beg for a plea deal that keeps him out of federal prison. I do not want him to get a plea deal. I want him buried so deep under the federal penal system that he never sees daylight again. To do that, the crime must be fully executed. The wire transfer must clear. The funds must hit his account. The moment he touches a single dollar of that money, the federal jurisdiction locks in permanently. Marcus let out a low whistle. You are letting him build his own gallows. Exactly, I said. They threw my child out of her home on the day we buried her father. They tried to erase my existence to satisfy their own greed. A simple eviction is too kind for what they have done. I want Beatrice to believe she has won. I want Chantel to go on a shopping spree with that stolen money. I want Darius to feel like the king of Atlanta for a few fleeting weeks. Let them climb to the very highest peak of their delusion. The higher they climb, the more devastating the fall will be when I finally pull the rug out from under them. Instruct our contacts at the title company to ignore any red flags from that specific lender. Open the gates and let the Trojan horse inside. I understand perfectly, Marcus replied, his voice settling into a tone of absolute compliance. I will monitor the transaction quietly from our side. Once the funds are fully dispersed and moved into his personal accounts, the federal wire fraud charges become undeniable. At that point, the FBI will have automatic jurisdiction over the case. We will have everything documented and ready to hand over to the district attorney when you give the green light. Keep me updated on every single movement of that money I instructed. I want to know when it clears, where it goes, and exactly how much they spend. We are going to let them choke on their own gluttony. I slowly hung up the phone and placed it gently on the desk. The flawless trap was set. The bait was swallowed, and the final countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. I turned away from the panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline and walked over to the discreet mahogany paneling on the far side of my office. Pressing my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner, I waited for the faint mechanical click that signaled the release of the heavy steel door behind the wood. The wall slid open to reveal my personal vault. This was not a simple safe for jewelry or petty cash. This vault held the foundational architecture of the empire Jamal and I had built together. It held the truth. I reached inside and pulled out a thick leather-bound portfolio embossed with the Vanguard Holdings crest. Carrying it back to my desk, I felt the familiar weight of absolute certainty settle into my hands. Beatrice and Chantel had chosen to rely on a cheap forgery crafted in a desperate panic. I relied on airtight corporate law. I opened the portfolio and spread the contents across the immaculate surface of my desk. The first document I pulled was the original warranty deed for the South Fulton estate. 5 years ago, Beatrice had nearly lost that house to foreclosure because she had gambled away her savings at casinos in Biloxi while trying to maintain the illusion of a wealthy socialite. Jamal had been distraught, but he refused to co-sign a loan for her. Instead, we executed a much smarter strategy. Vanguard Holdings purchased the distressed debt directly from the bank and acquired the deed. Beatrice was allowed to stay in the house, believing Jamal was simply paying her mortgage out of his own pocket. In reality, she was living in a property owned entirely by my private equity firm. The deed in front of me clearly listed Vanguard Holdings as the sole legal owner. Darius and Chantel had just taken out a massive loan against a corporate asset they had absolutely no legal right to touch. Next, I retrieved the tax records. For the past 5 years, every single property tax payment for the South Fulton estate had been routed through a blind trust that I personally managed. I laid out the bank statements and the official county tax receipts side by side. The paper trail was flawless. It showed a direct, unbroken line of capital flowing from Vanguard Holdings straight to the Fulton County Tax Commissioner. There was no mention of Beatrice, no mention of Chantel, and certainly no mention of Darius anywhere in the financial history of the property. When the federal investigators eventually subpoenaed these records, they would not see a grieving family fighting over a childhood home. They would see a corporate entity that had dutifully maintained a property only to fall victim to a brazen attempt at mortgage fraud by unauthorized individuals. The financial footprint was a masterpiece of asset protection. Finally, I reached into the very back of the leather portfolio and pulled out a crisp, sealed envelope. My heart tightened just a fraction as I looked at the heavy paper. This was the original, authentic last will and testament of Jamal Brooks. I broke the seal and carefully unfolded the document. Unlike the sloppy, amateurish forgery Darius had thrown onto the kitchen island, this document was a fortress of legal precision. It had been drafted by a premier estate planning firm in Buckhead, witnessed by 2 senior partners, and stamped by a reputable notary public whose license was actually valid. I traced my finger over Jamal's signature at the bottom of the final page. The sharp, rapid hook of his J, the aggressive underline, the unmistakable velocity of a surgeon who spent his days signing critical medical charts. It was undeniably his. The contrast between this genuine signature and the rounded traced imitation Chantel had presented was almost laughable. The contents of the authentic will were equally uncompromising. Jamal left absolutely nothing to Beatrice or Chantel. Every investment account, every life insurance policy, and his entire personal estate were placed into an irrevocable trust for Maya, with me designated as the sole trustee and executor. Jamal had known exactly how vicious his mother and sister could be when money was involved. He had designed this document specifically to form an impenetrable shield around our daughter. Looking at his signature, I felt a surge of profound gratitude for the brilliant, fiercely protective man I had married. He had given me all the weapons I needed. All I had to do now was aim and fire. As I carefully placed the authentic will next to the property deed and the tax records my encrypted private line illuminated, the caller identification displayed the name Donovan. He was a former federal investigator who now ran an elite private intelligence firm for high-net-worth clients. I had retained his services immediately after leaving the South Fulton house, instructing him to dig into every single corner of Darius and Chantel's lives. I pressed the speaker button. "Donovan," I said, keeping my tone strictly professional. "Tell me you have something useful." "Morning, Nia." Donovan replied, his deep, gravelly voice filling the office. "Useful is an understatement. I have spent the last 48 hours tearing through their digital footprint, their banking history, and their credit reports. You asked why Darius would risk federal prison for a home equity line of credit. I found the answer. They are not just greedy, they are suffocating. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. Walk me through it. Let us start with your brother-in-law. Donovan, said the sound of pages shuffling echoing through the speaker. Darius loudly branded himself a cryptocurrency visionary, but his trading history is a bloodbath. 6 months ago, he engaged in highly leveraged margin trading on an unregulated offshore exchange. When the crypto market took a sudden dip, his positions were liquidated. He is currently in the hole for roughly $800,000. But that is not the worst part. To try and cover his margin calls and chase his losses, he took out substantial loans from alternative lending sources. Alternative sources, I asked, raising an eyebrow. You mean loan sharks? Exactly, Donovan confirmed. He owes some very dangerous people a lot of money. They have been calling his personal cell phone up to 20 times a day. I pulled his phone records. The messages are escalating from polite demands to explicit physical threats. Darius is terrified. That $500,000 loan he fraudulently secured against your property is not seed money for a new business venture. It is a desperate, frantic attempt to keep his kneecaps intact. He needs that cash to pay off the people hunting him down. A cold smile touched my lips. The picture was becoming crystal clear. Darius was a cornered animal making reckless moves out of sheer terror. And what about Chantel? I asked. Does she know her husband is drowning in illicit debt? If she does, she certainly is not acting like it, Donovan replied with a dry chuckle. Your sister-in-law is living in a complete alternate reality. I pulled her credit history. It is a disaster class in financial illiteracy. She currently holds 7 premium credit cards. 5 of them are completely maxed out, and the other 2 are in active default. She owes over $120,000 in revolving consumer debt. The spending patterns are staggering. In the last 30 days alone, while her brother was in the hospital fighting for his life, she purchased 2 authentic Birkin bags, charged a luxury vacation to Tulum, and spent $15,000 on custom jewelry. I shook my head, feeling dark satisfaction. Chantel had always treated Jamal like a personal bank account, whining about how she deserved the finer things simply for existing. She was attempting to maintain the facade of a wealthy socialite, while her financial foundation crumbled beneath her designer heels. There is more, Donovan continued. Chantel leases a brand new Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon. She is 4 months behind on the payments. The dealership issued a repossession order. I tracked the vehicle. She has been parking it inside a locked garage 2 blocks away and walking home just to avoid the repo men. They are completely tapped out, Nia. They have 0 liquid cash, their credit is destroyed, and creditors are closing in. That forged will, and the subsequent bank fraud was a Hail Mary pass. They saw Jamal's death not as a tragedy, but as a bailout. They threw you and Maya out into the street because they needed absolute uninterrupted access to what they believed was a gold mine. I absorbed the barrage of information, my mind rapidly calculating the tactical advantages of their desperation. They were pathetic. They were 2 hollow, image-obsessed frauds trying to uphold a wealthy lifestyle on a foundation of lies, stolen money, and sheer stupidity. They had assumed I was weak and naive, an easy target they could bully and discard. They assumed wrong. Send me the complete dossier, Donovan, I commanded. Every credit card statement, every threatening text message from the loan sharks, and the repossession order for the Mercedes. I want it all compiled, indexed, and formatted for a federal prosecutor. I want their absolute destitution mapped out in undeniable black and white data. The encrypted file is already transferring to your secure server, Donovan said. You have enough ammunition here to annihilate them financially, legally, and socially. What is your next move? I looked down at the documents spread across my desk. The Vanguard Holdings deed, the pristine tax records, the authentic, legally binding will of my late husband. I had everything I needed to orchestrate a symphony of destruction. My next move is patience, I replied, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. I am going to let Darius receive the fraudulent funds. I am going to let Chantel parade around Atlanta pretending she is an heiress. I am going to let Beatrice organize her little social events in a house she does not own. I want them to feel completely safe and entirely victorious. Because when the federal agents finally kick the doors down and drag them out in handcuffs, I want them to lose everything in front of the very people they have been trying so desperately to impress. I ended the call and closed the leather portfolio. The legal arsenal was fully assembled, locked and loaded. The trap was armed. Now all I had to do was wait for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. How does that sound? 4 weeks passed since the day we buried Jamal. 4 weeks since they threw Maya and me out of the house. During that time, I did not send a single text message. I did not make a single phone call. I simply sat in my penthouse and watched the digital tripwires I had set up light up one by one. Marcus confirmed that the $500,000 loan had been approved and fully dispersed into a newly created bank account controlled by Darius. The money had crossed state lines during the wire transfer, officially cementing the federal jurisdiction of the crime. The bait was swallowed whole. But instead of laying low, Beatrice, Chantel, and Darius decided to celebrate their massive delusion. They decided to throw a party. And not just any party. They organized what they shamelessly dubbed the Black and White Memorial Gala. It was advertised on social media as an elegant high society tribute to honor Jamal's legacy. In reality, it was a grotesque, shallow networking event designed to show off to the elite circles of Atlanta and launder Darius's rapidly deteriorating image. They were using my dead husband's name as a shiny wrapper for their own narcissism. And the most poetic part of it all was that they were funding this extravagant circus using the stolen federal funds they had fraudulently extracted against my corporate property. I knew every detail of their sickening preparations because I still possessed absolute control over the South Fulton Estate's smart home security system. From the comfort of my executive office at Vanguard Holdings, I watched the high-definition audio-enabled surveillance feeds broadcast the entire spectacle directly onto my encrypted tablet. The audacity on display was absolutely breathtaking. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2 days before their grand event, and the South Fulton property looked like the staging ground for a royal wedding. Massive white tents were being erected across the manicured back lawn. Dozens of event planners, florists, and caterers scrambled around the property like terrified ants, barking orders and carrying towering centerpieces of imported white orchids and black roses. In the center of the chaos stood Beatrice. She wore a tailored silk pantsuit holding a clipboard she had snatched from the lead event coordinator, dictating orders with the haughty arrogance of a monarch addressing her peasants. She pointed a manicured finger at a young catering assistant who was struggling to carry a massive silver champagne fountain. "Move that fountain to the center of the foyer." Beatrice barked, her voice echoing sharply through the hidden camera microphone in the hallway. "Do not scratch the hardwood floors. These floors are imported Brazilian oak. This house is a cornerstone of our family legacy, and I will not have it ruined by clumsy hands. I need the caviar stations positioned exactly 10 feet away from the ice sculptures. We are hosting the mayor, 2 city councilmen, and the senior deacons of Mount Zion Baptist. Everything must be absolutely flawless. Do you understand me?" The exhausted catering assistant nodded frantically and scurried away. Beatrice turned to the lead event planner, a highly sought-after professional in Atlanta, who looked like she was deeply regretting taking this contract. "You have to understand the standard I demand," Beatrice continued, flipping her hair and leaning closer to the event planner. "My son Jamal was a brilliant surgeon. He provided everything for this family. He carried so much weight on his shoulders, especially having to drag around his miserable gold-digging wife. She was just a low-level accountant, completely classless. She brought absolutely nothing to his life but stress and a pathetic wardrobe. I had to personally step in and manage this estate the moment he passed, because she tried to run off with his money. Good riddance, I say. Now this house can finally reflect the true elegance of the Brooks family bloodline without her dragging down our aesthetic." I watched the screen, my expression entirely blank. Beatrice was standing in a house owned by my corporation, spending money fraudulently borrowed against my asset, and using the moment to boast about her wealth while degrading my character to hired help. Her narcissism was a bottomless pit. She truly believed her own fabricated reality. She believed she was a high society matriarch who had heroically rescued her son's legacy from a predatory woman. She was forcing the caterers and event planners to work grueling overtime hours just to ensure her vanity project looked perfect for Instagram. The sheer scale of the catering order alone must have cost tens of thousands of dollars. They were burning through the stolen funds with terrifying speed. The camera feed switched as Chantel walked into the foyer holding a glass of expensive champagne and wearing a designer dress that still had the tags tucked inside the collar. She was trailing behind Darius, who was loudly talking on his cell phone. Darius was pacing back and forth across the custom rug, waving his free hand emphatically. He was trying to sound like a formidable business mogul, but he just sounded like a desperate con artist reading a script. I leaned closer to my tablet, turning up the volume to catch every word of his conversation. This was the man who had forged my husband's signature, and I wanted to hear exactly how he was spinning his new stolen wealth. "I am telling you, man, the liquidity is secured," Darius boasted loudly into his phone, making sure the caterers could hear him. "We had a massive capital injection this week, a $500,000 line of credit fully approved and resting in the corporate accounts. My decentralized finance startup is officially launching the beta platform next month. I need you to tell the investors that the Brooks family stands behind this venture completely. We are hosting a massive gala this weekend. Tell the partners to come through. I will have VIP tables set up for them. We are serving top-shelf everything. This is how we do business in Atlanta." Darius ended the call with a smug, self-satisfied grin and turned to Chantel. "Did you hear that baby?" Darius asked, grabbing Chantel by the waist and kissing her cheek. "The whole city is going to be at this party. The investors are coming. The politicians are coming. We are officially back on top. We are going to take this capital and multiply it 10 times over." Chantel giggled, taking a sip of her champagne and leaning into him. "I knew you would figure it out, Darius. We deserve this. After dealing with all that stress from Nia and her pathetic little temper tantrum, we deserve to celebrate. I just ordered 3 custom-tailored suits for you for the gala, and I hired a celebrity makeup artist for me and Mom. We are going to look like royalty." I watched the two of them celebrate their supposed genius. Darius was actively using a memorial service for my dead husband to network with shady investors and launder his ruined reputation. He wanted to parade around the estate, pointing to the expensive ice sculptures and the flowing champagne, using the stolen funds to create an illusion of extreme financial success. He was trying to convince his loan sharks and his skeptical business partners that he was a man of immense wealth and power. He was setting up a massive stage to perform his final, most elaborate lie. And Chantel was right there beside him, completely oblivious to the federal prison sentence hovering directly over her husband's head, entirely focused on celebrity makeup artists and tailored suits. The preparation continued relentlessly into the evening. I watched through the cameras as delivery trucks pulled up to the driveway, unloading pallets of premium liquor, customized stage lighting, and professional sound equipment. Beatrice marched up and down the driveway, shouting at the delivery drivers to be careful with the landscaping. She was treating the property as if she had personally laid every brick and planted every rosebush. She complained to anyone who would listen about the burden of hosting such a prestigious event, while simultaneously basking in the attention and the perceived authority it gave her. She was starving for validation, desperate for the world to view her as the wealthy, sophisticated matriarch she had always pretended to be. At one point, the lead planner approached Beatrice with an invoice for additional lighting. Beatrice did not even blink. She snatched the invoice, pulled out a sleek credit card linked directly to the fraudulent loan account, and handed it over with a dramatic flourish. "Put it on the premium card," Beatrice instructed loudly. The perfect trap was finally fully set. The gala would start tomorrow night. They would smile, pose for photographs, and toast to my husband's memory, while standing on a mountain of illegal debt. I smiled coldly at the screen. Their absolute destruction was finally ready to begin. Let them drink the stolen champagne. The morning of the gala arrived with a flurry of frantic activity at the South Fulton estate. I sat at my desk in the Vanguard Holdings executive suite, my eyes locked onto the security feeds broadcasting across my monitor. The caterers were setting up the outdoor dining arrangements, and a string quartet was rehearsing in the grand foyer. It was a sickening display of fraudulent wealth. I watched with detached amusement, sipping my coffee, waiting for the inevitable collapse. But then a familiar vehicle pulled up to the front security gate. My heart skipped a beat. It was a modest, older model sedan. My mother, Valerie, stepped out of the driver's seat and approached the intercom. My mother had absolutely no idea about my true financial status. She did not know about Vanguard Holdings, the penthouse, or the trap I had meticulously laid for Beatrice and Darius. She still believed I was a struggling accountant who had been mercilessly evicted by a cruel mother-in-law. I had deliberately kept her in the dark to shield her from the legal crossfire and the toxic fallout. She was a gentle, deeply religious woman who worked as a retired schoolteacher, someone who believed in grace and forgiveness. She thought Maya and I were staying in a modest, extended-stay hotel while I looked for a new apartment. She had come to the estate today with a pure, simple intention. She wanted to retrieve a few of Jamal's personal keepsakes to comfort her grieving granddaughter. I watched through the high-definition gate camera as my mother politely requested entry from the hired event security guards. She explained she just needed a few minutes to collect a photo album and a silver pocket watch Jamal had promised to give Maya. The guards, unaware of the family dynamics, opened the gate and allowed her to drive up the winding, manicured driveway. I leaned closer to the monitor, a knot of genuine anxiety forming in my stomach. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over my mother's contact name, ready to call her and tell her to turn around. But I stopped. If I called her now, I would have to explain everything, and the operation was too close to execution. I had to let this play out. My mother parked her car near the front fountain and walked up the wide stone steps to the grand entrance. She was wearing a simple conservative floral dress, looking entirely out of place amid the lavish floral arrangements and bustling event staff. Before she could even ring the doorbell, the heavy double doors swung open. Beatrice stepped out onto the porch, flanked immediately by Chantel. Beatrice was wearing a silk morning robe, holding a steaming cup of coffee in a porcelain mug. Her face, which had been smiling at a florist just seconds before, instantly hardened into a mask of pure contempt when she saw my mother standing on her porch. Valerie, Beatrice said, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "What on earth are you doing trespassing on my property on the day of my son's memorial gala? You were explicitly not invited to this event." My mother maintained her gentle composure, clasping her hands together in front of her. "Good morning, Beatrice. I am not here to attend your party or cause any disruption. Maya has been crying for her father every single night. Jamal had a specific leather photo album in his study and a silver pocket watch he always told Maya would belong to her. Nia left in such a rush that she could not pack them. I just came to ask if I could quickly retrieve those two items for my granddaughter. It would bring her a lot of comfort." Chantel let out a loud, theatrical scoff, crossing her arms over her chest. "Are you serious right now? You drove all the way up here to beg for handouts. Jamal's belongings are part of his estate, and as the legal heirs, everything inside this house belongs to us. We are not running a charity for Nia and her kid." My mother looked at Chantel, clearly taken aback by the sheer hostility. "Chantel, these are not items of significant financial value. They are purely sentimental keepsakes for a 6-year-old girl who just lost her father. Surely you can find it in your heart to let her have a piece of his memory." "There is no room for sentimentality when dealing with gold diggers," Beatrice spat, stepping closer to the edge of the porch to look down at my mother. "Your daughter tried to bleed my son dry. She lived a life of luxury on his dime, contributing absolutely nothing to his legacy. And now that her meal ticket is gone, she sends her mother to grovel at my doorstep. Tell Nia that if she wanted keepsakes, she should have grabbed them before she was rightfully evicted." I watched the screen, my grip tightening on the edge of my mahogany desk until my knuckles turned white. My mother kept her voice steady, refusing to be intimidated by Beatrice's towering arrogance. "Nia is a good, hard-working woman," my mother replied, her tone firm but polite. "She loved Jamal deeply. You have no right to speak about her that way, and you certainly have no right to withhold memories from your own granddaughter. Maya has Jamal's blood running through her veins." "Do not you dare bring up bloodlines to me!" Beatrice yelled, splashing a few drops of hot coffee onto the stone porch. "Maya is a product of your daughter's manipulation. You people come from nothing. You have nothing. You raised a daughter who thought she could secure a permanent bag by trapping a wealthy doctor. Well, the bank is closed. I am throwing this gala tonight to honor my son properly, surrounded by the elite families of Atlanta people of actual status. The last thing I need is the mother of an unemployed accountant loitering on my porch and ruining the aesthetic of my event." Chantel turned toward the driveway and snapped her fingers loudly at two burly event security guards who were directing catering vans. "Hey, you two come over here right now." The guards jogged over, looking confused. Chantel pointed a manicured finger directly at my mother. "This woman is trespassing on private property. She is harassing the homeowners and trying to steal items from the estate. Escort this beggar off the premises immediately. If she resists, call the local precinct and have her arrested." The guards exchanged an uncomfortable glance, clearly seeing that my mother was just a harmless older woman. "Ma'am," one of the guards said gently, gesturing toward the driveway, "I am going to have to ask you to return to your vehicle and vacate the property." My mother looked at Beatrice and Chantel, her eyes filled with a profound, quiet sorrow. She did not yell. She did not curse. She simply shook her head. "May God forgive you for the darkness in your hearts," my mother said softly, "because the universe has a way of returning exactly what you put out into it." "Get her out of my sight!" Beatrice shrieked, waving her hand frantically. "I have a major gala to host, and I will not have my morning ruined by trash." The guards placed their hands gently on my mother's shoulders and guided her down the steps. She walked back to her modest sedan with her head held high, maintaining her dignity, even as Chantel hurled one last insult from the porch, telling her to go back to the slums. My mother climbed into her car, started the engine, and slowly drove out of the security gates. I sat in my high-rise office, my eyes glued to the security feed, until my mother's car completely disappeared down the street. The silence in my executive suite was absolute. I felt a physical shift happen inside my chest. The cold, calculated patience I had maintained for the last 4 weeks vanished entirely. It evaporated, replaced by a white-hot, ruthless determination that burned through my veins like liquid fire. They had insulted my career. They had forged documents. They had thrown my daughter out into the night. I had tolerated all of it because it was part of a broader tactical strategy. But humiliating my mother, a woman who had done nothing but show them grace, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They called her a beggar. They had armed guards escort her away like a criminal. They insulted the very woman who sacrificed everything to ensure I could build the empire I now commanded. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Marcus. He answered instantly. "Marcus," I said, my voice eerily calm, stripped of all emotion. "The timeline has moved up. We execute the final phase tonight right in the middle of their gala. Call the district attorney and tell the federal agents to gear up. I want the arrest warrants active and ready by sunset." "Are you sure?" Marcus asked. "We were scheduled to wait until Monday." "I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life," I replied, my gaze fixed on the frozen image of Beatrice smirking on the porch. "They want an elite, unforgettable event. I am going to give them a spectacle that Atlanta high society will talk about for the rest of their miserable lives. Prepare the documents. Tonight I burn their kingdom to the ground." I ended the call with Marcus and immediately locked my computer workstation. I did not waste time screaming or throwing objects across my immaculate office. Anger without action was a useless emotion, and I needed cold, calculated precision for what was about to happen next. I grabbed my leather portfolio, the one containing every single piece of financial and legal evidence required to destroy the family of my husband, and took my private elevator down to the secure parking garage. Slipping behind the wheel of my car, I navigated out of the Buckhead high-rise and merged onto the interstate, heading straight into downtown Atlanta. My destination was not a local police precinct. A local precinct would drag this out in civil court or view it as a petty domestic dispute over a dead man. I was aiming significantly higher. I parked a few blocks away from the Richard B. Russell Federal Building, the imposing structure housing the regional headquarters for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Marcus was already standing near the security checkpoint when I walked up the concrete steps. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, holding a matching briefcase that perfectly complemented my own. He gave me a single crisp nod of confirmation. The meeting was fully prepared and waiting for us on the 8th floor. We passed through the metal detectors and rode the elevator in total silence. There was no need for strategy discussions. We both knew the objective. We were about to hand federal prosecutors a completely flawless, airtight case of massive corporate and bank fraud on a silver platter. The heavy elevator doors chimed open and a junior agent escorted us down a long, sterile corridor into a windowless conference room. Sitting at the long table were the two people who would execute final vengeance. Special Agent Thomas Hayes of the White Collar Crime Division stood up and offered a firm handshake. Beside him was Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Jenkins, a woman known for securing convictions against high-profile scammers across the southeast region of the country. They had reviewed the preliminary digital files Marcus sent over, but they needed the physical documents and my sworn statement to initiate the raid. I sat down directly across from them, placing my portfolio onto the center of the wooden table. I unzipped the leather binder and began distributing the documents with the methodical efficiency of a seasoned executive. I handed Agent Hayes the original authentic last will and testament that my husband Jamal had drafted. I watched his eyes scan the crisp legal language and the legitimate signatures of the witnesses. Then I handed him the printed copy of the forged will that Darius had submitted to the bank. The difference in signature velocity and stroke direction was immediately apparent even to an untrained eye. I gave Attorney Jenkins the warranty deed clearly demonstrating Vanguard Holdings possessed absolute legal ownership. I followed that with 5 years of blind trust tax records proving our uninterrupted corporate stewardship. Finally, I handed over the explosive loan origination documents Marcus had intercepted. Darius had successfully closed a home equity line of credit for $500,000 against the corporate asset. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands together. The sister of my husband and her spouse utilized a blatantly forged document to declare themselves the legal executors of an estate they do not own, I explained to the federal officers. Furthermore, they used that fraudulent authority to encumber a corporate asset belonging to Vanguard Holdings. The borrowed funds were deposited into their personal accounts this morning. Agent Hayes carefully aligned the forged will next to the Vanguard Holdings deed. His expression shifted into one of profound professional satisfaction. "The audacity of this scheme is staggering," Agent Hayes murmured, tracing the fake signature with the back of his pen. "They targeted a grieving widow, assuming you lacked the resources or the mental fortitude to challenge their claim. They expected you to disappear quietly into the night. They grossly miscalculated your professional background and your corporate infrastructure." Attorney Jenkins leaned forward, her eyes scanning the loan origination paperwork. "This is a remarkably clean prosecution," she stated, adjusting her glasses. "The fact that Darius utilized a corrupt notary to push the paperwork through the local county clerk office gives us multiple avenues for conspiracy charges. However, the true leverage lies in the mechanics of the loan itself. The lender they chose is a national bank chartered under federal regulations. By submitting fraudulent documentation to a federally insured institution to secure a $500,000 loan, Darius has committed textbook bank fraud." I nodded, maintaining direct eye contact with the prosecutor. "And the wire transfer?" I asked, steering the conversation toward the most devastating charge available. Attorney Jenkins smiled a sharp, predatory expression. "Exactly," she confirmed. "Marcus provided us with the routing data this morning. The bank dispersed the funds electronically from their primary holding facility in New York, directly into the new account Darius opened here in Georgia. Because the transmission of those stolen funds crossed state lines via an electronic banking network, this instantly escalated from a severe local crime into federal wire fraud. That specific federal statute carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in federal prison per count. Darius just guaranteed himself a very long stay in a federal penitentiary, and Chantel is fully implicated. The entire room fell into a heavy, focused silence as the absolute certainty of their destruction settled over the table. Beatrice, Chantel, and Darius had spent the last 4 weeks basking in a delusion of supreme victory. They had driven my mother away from the property like a vagrant. They had spent thousands of dollars on luxury fashion and catering deposits. They genuinely believed they had successfully stolen my life. They had no idea that they were currently standing on a federal landmine, and I was holding the detonator. I have one strict condition regarding the execution of these arrest warrants, I announced, breaking the silence in the room. Agent Hayes looked up from the documents, giving me his full attention. "We are ready to move quickly, Mrs. Brooks," he replied. "The magistrate judge will sign the warrants within the hour. We can send a tactical team to the South Fulton property by early tomorrow morning to take them into federal custody quietly and securely." I shook my head slowly, my gaze turning cold and unyielding. "Absolutely not," I commanded. "I do not want them arrested quietly tomorrow morning. I want them arrested tonight, right in the middle of their lavish memorial gala. They are currently using the name of my dead husband to throw a high society networking event funded by stolen federal money. They are parading around my corporate property, entertaining politicians, pastors, and wealthy investors. They care about their social status above all else. A quiet morning arrest allows them to hide their shame behind closed doors. I want them humiliated in front of the exact audience they are trying to impress." Attorney Jenkins exchanged a meaningful glance with Agent Hayes. The prosecutor recognized the raw, brilliant justice in my demand. A public arrest ensures maximum impact. It would also prevent Darius from attempting to flee or hide the remaining funds once he realized the walls were closing in. "You want to make an example out of them?" Agent Hayes noted a hint of respect coloring his tone. "I want to completely dismantle them," I corrected him smoothly. "I want Beatrice to watch her golden child and her supposedly brilliant son-in-law get dragged out of her fake mansion in handcuffs. I want the entire congregation of Mount Zion Baptist to see the depth of their greed and moral bankruptcy. And most importantly, I want to be standing in the center of that ballroom when it happens. I am requesting permission to accompany the federal agents during the raid tonight. I will personally inform Beatrice that the house she is proudly displaying to her guests belongs to me. Then your tactical team can execute the warrants." Agent Hayes considered the logistical implications for a brief moment before nodding his approval. "It is unorthodox, but considering you are the legal owner and chief executive officer of the corporation holding the deed, you have every right to access the property at any time," he stated. "We will stage our vehicles 2 blocks away from the estate. You will enter the gala first. Once you secure the floor and confront them, my team will breach the main entrance and lock down the event space. Nobody will leave until Darius and Chantel are safely in federal custody." I stood up from the conference table, smoothing the lapels of my tailored jacket. The blueprint was finalized. The federal trap was primed. I thanked the 2 agents and walked out. Riding down to the secure parking garage, I felt a deep, absolute power. My mourning period was over. The executioner had arrived. The night air was thick and humid as I drove my sleek black SUV back toward the South Fulton estate. Massive floodlights illuminated the meticulously manicured grounds, casting a theatrical glow against the night sky. The street was lined with luxury vehicles, and hired valet drivers in crisp uniforms sprinted back and forth, parking the Bentleys, Porsches, and custom sedans of Atlanta's elite. Beatrice and Darius had truly spared no expense utilizing the stolen federal funds. They wanted to cement their status among the local politicians, megachurch pastors, and influential business owners who were currently sipping expensive champagne on my corporate property. I parked my vehicle discreetly down the street, slipping out into the shadows. I walked toward the front gates, with measured, deliberate steps. The private security guards Darius hired were stationed at the entrance, holding clipboards and checking invitations. I completely ignored them. As the legal owner of the estate, I had retained master access to the smart home security protocol. I bypassed the main gate entirely using a highly secure secondary digital access point near the side gardens that I knew the temporary security team would absolutely not be monitoring. The heavy iron gate clicked open silently. I stepped onto the grounds, the faint sound of a classical string quartet drifting through the warm evening air. I took a deep breath, letting the anticipation settle into my bones. The execution was about to commence. I moved silently through the shadows of the expansive wrap-around porch, stopping just outside the massive French doors that led into the grand ballroom. The space had been transformed into a lavish, ostentatious display of black and white elegance. Towering arrangements of white orchids and black roses dominated every table. Crystal champagne flutes glittered under the expensive temporary lighting rigs they had installed. Waiters in immaculate white tuxedos circulated through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and truffle hors d'oeuvres. At the far end of the room, a custom stage had been erected. And standing center stage, bathed in a brilliant spotlight, was Beatrice. She wore a stunning custom-beaded black evening gown, paired with an outrageous diamond necklace that easily cost more than the average person's annual salary. She held a microphone in one hand and a glass of vintage champagne in the other. Her face was a mask of practiced serene grief, completely devoid of actual tears. She was holding court, commanding the attention of every single influential guest in the room. "We are gathered here tonight not to mourn the loss of my brilliant son, Jamal," Beatrice proclaimed, her voice echoing through the expensive surround sound system. "We are here to celebrate his extraordinary legacy." Jamal was the pillar of the Brooks family. He carried the weight of the world on his broad shoulders. He ensured that our family name would remain synonymous with excellence and prosperity. She paused, taking a delicate sip of champagne, soaking in the sympathetic murmurs from the captivated audience. "The past 4 weeks have tested my spirit," she continued, placing a dramatic hand over her heart. "We also faced betrayal from those we thought we could trust, people who tried to exploit my son's good nature and walk away with the fruits of his labor. But the Brooks family is resilient. We are unbreakable. Through the brilliant financial stewardship of my son-in-law Darius and the unwavering strength of my daughter Chantel, we have preserved this magnificent estate. We have secured our future. We stand before you tonight to declare that our legacy will not be stolen by greedy outsiders. We are stronger, wealthier, and more united than ever before." The crowd erupted into polite, admiring applause. Politicians nodded in agreement. Wealthy socialites dabbed at their dry eyes. Beatrice raised her glass high, basking in the absolute pinnacle of her narcissistic delusion. She had successfully painted herself as the heroic, affluent matriarch who had triumphed over the evil gold-digging widow. It was the perfect dramatic peak of her lie, and it was the exact moment I chose to shatter it completely. I stepped up to the heavy, custom mahogany double doors leading into the ballroom. I did not knock. I placed both hands flat against the polished wood and shoved them open with staggering force. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. The applause died in the throats of the guests. Hundreds of heads turned simultaneously toward the entrance. I stepped into the light of the ballroom. I was not the broken, homeless, pathetic widow they had been whispering about. I was wearing a striking, custom-tailored, brilliant white Tom Ford power suit. The sharp, aggressive cut of the blazer emphasized absolute authority, paired with stilettos that clicked loudly against the imported Brazilian oak floors. I radiated pure, unadulterated power, wealth, and command. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless style, and my expression was a mask of cold, predatory calculation. I walked slowly into the center of the room, the crowd instinctively parting to make way for me. The silence was absolute heavy with shock and confusion. I stared directly at the stage. Beatrice's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering into dozens of glittering pieces on the stage floor. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. Chantel, standing near the caviar station, dropped her plate. The homeless widow narrative they had spent 4 weeks meticulously crafting disintegrated the moment I crossed the threshold. Darius was the first to react. Seeing his entire fraudulent empire threatened by my sheer presence, panic overtook his common sense. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He shoved his way through the crowd of elite guests. He stormed directly toward me. "What the hell do you think you are doing here?" Darius hissed, lowering his voice to a threatening growl as he closed the distance between us. He reached out and forcefully grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging into the pristine white fabric of my blazer. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I simply looked down at his hand gripping my arm and then locked my eyes dead onto his terrified face. "Let go of me, Darius," I stated, my voice dangerously calm, but carrying enough edge to make the guests standing nearby take a cautious step backward. "You are making a terrible mistake." Darius tightened his grip completely and utterly blinded by his own frantic desperation to maintain control of the room. "You are the one making a mistake." "Nia," he spat, leaning his face close to mine. "You have 10 seconds to turn around and walk your pathetic self right back out those doors. You are trespassing on private property. If you do not leave this instant, I am calling the police and having you dragged out of here in handcuffs for crashing a private event. You lost. Accept it and get the hell out of my house." I looked at his sweaty, panicked face. I looked at Beatrice, who was still frozen on the stage, clutching the microphone stand like a lifeline. Darius desperately wanted to call the local police to remove the trespasser. He had absolutely no idea that I had brought the law with me. I smiled. It was the same icy, terrifying smile I had given him the night he threw me out. I smoothly took a single deliberate step backward, easily breaking his frantic grip on my arm. I slowly brushed the spot on my pristine white blazer where his fingers had rested. "You want to call the police, Darius?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the dead-silent ballroom. "That will not be necessary. I took the liberty of bringing them with me." I snapped my fingers once. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot. The shadows in the grand foyer behind me suddenly moved. The heavy double doors swung open wider, and the trap I had carefully laid at the federal building sprang shut with devastating precision. Special Agent Thomas Hayes and Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Jenkins stepped into the brilliant light of the ballroom. They were flanked immediately by 2 heavily armed federal agents. Beside them stood the local county sheriff, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. The federal task force fanned out instantly, forming an impenetrable wall of law enforcement right in the entryway of the opulent gala. The collective gasp from the high society guests was audible. Politicians discreetly backed away from the VIP tables. Pastors lowered their heads. The illusion of the Brooks family wealth evaporated in an instant, replaced by the terrifying, undeniable presence of a federal raid. Darius stumbled backward, his face losing all of its color. He looked from me to the federal agents, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. And he finally realized the magnitude of the mistake he had made. The executioner had brought the entire federal government to serve as our absolute, unquestionable witnesses. Beatrice stood frozen on the stage for only a fraction of a second before her deeply ingrained entitlement kicked in forcefully. She could not comprehend that the stern men standing in the foyer were actual federal agents. In her severely distorted reality, she remained the untouchable matriarch of South Fulton, and I was merely a nuisance attempting a pathetic stunt to ruin her perfect evening. She clutched her microphone with white-knuckled fingers and pointed aggressively toward the entrance. "Security!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking with shrill panic over the ballroom speakers. "I ordered you to keep the trash off my property. Remove this woman immediately." Throw her and these hired actors out into the street where they belong. The hired private security guards positioned around the ballroom perimeter hesitated. They looked at me in my custom white suit, and then they looked at Special Agent Hayes, who casually unclipped his federal badge from his leather belt and held it up high for the entire room to see clearly. The local sheriff rested his hand on his radio, giving the private guards a single stern look that communicated a crystal-clear warning. Do not intervene. The event security guards immediately took a collective step backward, folding their hands behind their backs and lowering their heads in compliance. They wanted absolutely no part of a federal raid. Beatrice frantically slammed her hand against the microphone stand. "I said, get her out of my house!" She shrieked, the veneer of high society elegance completely melting away to reveal the frantic, desperate woman beneath. I ignored her screaming completely. I stepped around Darius, who was still paralyzed with fear, and walked deliberately toward the front of the ballroom. The vast crowd of elite politicians, wealthy investors, and prominent church leaders parted before me like the Red Sea. I felt their eyes tracking my every movement, taking in the sharp lines of my Tom Ford suit and the absolute unyielding confidence in my stride. I reached the edge of the stage, stepped up the short flight of stairs, and walked directly toward the string quartet's vacant equipment area. I smoothly lifted a spare wireless microphone from its resting place on a sleek black stand. I turned the device on. "Remove me from my own property!" I asked, my voice projecting through the massive sound system, echoing off the high ceilings and instantly silencing Beatrice's frantic shouting. Beatrice gasped, taking a clumsy step backward. Her expensive high heels caught the edge of a speaker wire, and she nearly stumbled. Chantel rushed up the side stairs of the stage to catch her mother by the arm, her eyes wide with mounting terror. "This is not your property!" Nia Chantel yelled, trying to sound authoritative, but failing miserably in front of the crowd. "My brother left this estate to our mother. We have the legal documents to prove it. You have absolutely nothing." I looked at Chantel, allowing a cold, pitying smile to touch my lips. I slowly turned my gaze back to the hundreds of guests staring at us from the ballroom floor. "I want to thank you all for attending this beautiful gala," I announced smoothly, addressing the crowd of Atlanta elites. "Beatrice and Chantel have spent the entire evening regaling you with tales of their immense wealth and their deeply rooted family legacy. They have painted a picture of a grieving mother and a devoted sister, heroically protecting a family estate from a predatory broke widow. It is an incredibly compelling story. Unfortunately for them, it is a complete and total fabrication." I turned to face Beatrice directly. My eyes locked onto hers, piercing through her terrified facade. "Beatrice," I said, my tone dropping to a low, lethal register. "Let us take a walk down memory lane together. Let us go back exactly 5 years ago. Do you remember when this beautiful South Fulton estate was issued a public notice of foreclosure? Do you remember the terrifying letters from the bank threatening to throw you out into the street?" A collective gasp rippled through the grand ballroom. Politicians exchanged shocked glances. The senior deacons from her church murmured among themselves. Beatrice's jaw dropped open, her face turning a ghastly shade of gray. "You spent your entire life savings and maxed out multiple credit cards at the casinos in Biloxi." I continued, ensuring every single word echoed clearly across the silent room. "You gambled away your financial security trying to maintain the illusion that you were a woman of extreme status. When the bank finally came to collect you, ran to Jamal crying. You begged your son to bail you out. You begged him to save your precious social standing. But Jamal did not have the liquid capital to pay off your massive reckless debts. He could not afford to save you from ruin." "That is a lie," Beatrice screeched, her voice trembling so violently she dropped her microphone. It clattered loudly against the stage floor. "Jamal bought this house for me. He provided for his mother." "No, Beatrice," I corrected her, my voice slicing through her panic like a surgical blade. "Jamal did not buy this house. A private equity firm stepped in to purchase the distressed debt directly from the bank. That firm acquired the deed and allowed you to stay here rent-free to protect you from the ultimate humiliation of being evicted publicly. You thought Jamal was quietly paying your mortgage every month. He was not. This estate is owned entirely by Vanguard Holdings. Chantel scoffed, stepping in front of her mother in a desperate attempt to shield her. Vanguard Holdings is a corporate conglomerate. What does that have to do with you? You pathetic little accountant? I took a slow, deliberate step toward Chantel. I stared her down until she instinctively shrank back in fear. I am not a low-level accountant, Chantel. I stated the power in my voice, demanding absolute attention. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. I am the person who bought this debt. I am the person who paid the property taxes every single year through a blind trust. I am the owner of the very ground you are standing on today. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of deafening quiet that only occurs when an entire room witnesses a reality-shattering revelation. Beatrice swayed on her feet, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, realizing that every prominent figure in her social circle had just heard her darkest, most shameful secret exposed. Darius, who had finally managed to unglue his feet from the foyer floor, sprinted toward the stage. He looked frantic, his forehead glistening with nervous sweat under the lights. "Do not listen to her!" Darius shouted to the crowd, waving his hands erratically. "She is a grieving, delusional widow. She is making all of this up to ruin our event. We have the deed. We have the will." I did not even look at Darius. I kept my eyes locked on Beatrice and Chantel as I reached into my tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a small encrypted flash drive. I held it up for the entire room to see clearly. "I prefer to let the documents speak for themselves," I announced calmly. I gestured toward Marcus, who had seamlessly moved to the audio-visual control station at the edge of the ballroom. I tossed the flash drive to him. He caught it effortlessly and plugged it directly into the main laptop controlling the massive projector screens flanking the stage. The elegant slideshow of Jamal's photographs abruptly vanished from the screens. The screens flashed bright white for a second before displaying a high-resolution digitally scanned image of the original warranty deed for the South Fulton estate. The text was magnified so large that even the guests at the very back of the room could read it perfectly clearly. "Look at the screens, Beatrice," I commanded. "Look at the legal owner of your precious family legacy." Beatrice slowly turned her head toward the massive projector screen. Her eyes tracked across the illuminated document. There, in bold black ink, was the undeniable proof. The property was titled exclusively to Vanguard Holdings, LLC. There was no mention of Jamal Brooks. There was absolutely no mention of Beatrice Brooks anywhere on the page. Marcus tapped a key on the laptop and the screen transitioned to the next document. It was a certified financial ledger from the Fulton County Tax Commissioner. It clearly displayed 5 years of uninterrupted property tax payments originating directly from my corporate accounts. "You have been living in my house for half a decade, Beatrice," I said, my voice echoing relentlessly through the speakers. "You insulted my clothes. You insulted my career. You told your friends I was a penniless gold digger pulling your son down. Meanwhile, you were sleeping under a roof funded entirely by my corporate empire. I paid for the walls around you. I paid for the imported Brazilian oak floors you were so desperately trying to protect from the caterers earlier today. I own your reality." Chantel let out a strangled, breathless sound. She grabbed her mother's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into Beatrice's silk sleeve. "This cannot be real," Chantel whispered, her voice cracking with mounting terror. "Darius told us he checked the records. Darius said the will gave us everything." Marcus tapped the keyboard one final time. The screens transitioned to a side-by-side comparison. On the left side of the screen was the forged will Darius had presented to the bank. On the right side of the screen was the authentic, heavily notarized last will and testament that Jamal had actually drafted. I pointed to the screens, directing the entire crowd's attention to the documents. "The will your husband produced is a cheap, amateurish forgery, Chantel. Jamal's authentic will, the one displayed on the right, leaves absolutely nothing to you or your mother. Every single asset, every life insurance policy, and every investment account was placed into an irrevocable trust for our daughter Maya. I am the sole trustee and executor of that estate." The visual evidence was entirely irrefutable. The sharp contrast between the fake signature and Jamal's authentic rapid handwriting was glaringly obvious to everyone in the room. The local politicians and investors who had been chatting with Darius just minutes prior began whispering fiercely among themselves, quickly realizing they had been associating with a desperate fraudster. Beatrice and Chantel's faces drained of all remaining color. They looked like two ghosts standing under the bright stage lights. The smug arrogance, the high society entitlement, the toxic narcissism, it all evaporated, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated humiliation. Beatrice's knees finally buckled under the crushing weight of the absolute truth. She collapsed onto the stage floor, her expensive black evening gown pooling around her as she began to hyperventilate. Chantel dropped to her knees beside her mother, her hands trembling violently as she stared up at the massive projector screens. She looked back at me, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. She finally understood that I had never been the helpless victim she thought she could bully into submission. I was the architect of their total destruction. "You threw my 6-year-old daughter out into the street on the exact day we buried her father," I said, stepping closer to the two women cowering on the stage floor. "You thought you could steal her inheritance and claim my property to fund your pathetic, shallow lifestyles. You believed you held all the power." I paused, letting the absolute silence of the ballroom amplify my final words. "You chose the wrong widow to mess with." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. I kept my eyes locked on the pathetic figures cowering on the stage, before I turned my attention to the man who orchestrated the financial side of this disaster. Darius was slowly backing away from the stage, his eyes darting frantically toward the side exits. He was looking for an escape route, hoping he could slip out through the caterer's kitchen and disappear into the Atlanta night. He did not make it more than 5 steps. The two heavily armed federal agents stationed in the foyer moved with lightning speed, flanking the exit routes and placing their hands firmly on their tactical belts. Darius froze, his chest heaving as panic seized his entire body. I walked to the edge of the stage, still holding the microphone. I stared down at him. "You forged my dead husband's signature on a fake will," I stated, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers above. "You thought that was your masterstroke. But your real mistake, Darius, was using that fake will to take out a $500,000 line of credit on a house that belongs to my corporation." Darius shook his head violently, holding his hands up as if he could physically push my words away. "I do not know what you are talking about," he shouted, his voice cracking in terror. "That was a legitimate loan. The bank approved it. We submitted the paperwork in good faith." "Good faith," I echoed, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. "There is no good faith in mortgage fraud. You were drowning in $800,000 of cryptocurrency debt from offshore margin calls. You owe money to violent loan sharks who have been threatening your life for the past month. You needed cash immediately to save your own kneecaps, so you convinced your greedy wife and your delusional mother-in-law to throw a grieving widow and a fatherless 6-year-old child onto the street. You thought you could extract $500,000 from an estate you knew absolutely nothing about." Chantel scrambled to her feet, her designer dress stained with spilled champagne. She pointed a trembling finger at Darius, her survival instincts overriding her marital loyalty. "I did not know anything about his debts," Chantel screamed, throwing her husband completely under the bus. "He told me the business was thriving. He told me the loan was for a new tech startup. I am innocent." I turned my gaze to Chantel, slicing through her pathetic defense. "You are far from innocent, Chantel. You were absolutely complicit the moment you tossed my daughter clothes into trash bags. You helped forge the document because you needed that cash just as desperately as he did. I know about the 7 maxed-out premium credit cards. I know about the $120,000 in revolving consumer debt. I even know about the brand-new Mercedes G-Wagon you have been hiding in a locked garage 2 blocks away to avoid the repo men. You wanted to play the role of a wealthy socialite at my expense. Now you get to play the role of a federal co-conspirator." The elite guests in the ballroom began backing away from Chantel and Darius as if they were infected with a highly contagious disease. The wealthy investors Darius had invited to this gala, the people he was desperately trying to impress, were currently pulling out their cell phones to message their own attorneys, ensuring their names were instantly scrubbed from any association with his fraudulent tech company. His entire carefully crafted image was disintegrating in real time. I stepped back from the edge of the stage and lowered the microphone slightly. I looked toward the entrance and gave a single nod. "I am done talking to you," I announced. "I will let the authorities take it from here." I stepped aside as Special Agent Thomas Hayes and Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Jenkins marched down the center aisle of the ballroom. Their presence brought an immediate chilling reality to the room. Agent Hayes pulled a thick stack of folded warrants from the inside pocket of his federal windbreaker. "Darius Vance." Agent Hayes barked, his voice projecting unquestionable federal authority. "You are under arrest." Darius dropped to his knees right there on the imported Brazilian oak floors. He buried his face in his hands and began sobbing uncontrollably. It was a pathetic whimpering sound that stripped him of every ounce of fake bravado he had projected for the last decade. Agent Hayes stood over him, unspooling the list of charges with clinical precision. I held the microphone near him, so the entire ballroom could hear the absolute finality of their destruction. "You are being charged with federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and forgery," Agent Hayes declared loudly into the microphone. "You knowingly submitted fraudulent forged legal documents to a federally insured financial institution to secure a $500,000 loan against a corporate asset you did not own. Furthermore, you caused those stolen funds to be transmitted across state lines into your personal accounts. Those actions constitute severe federal crimes. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Two federal agents grabbed Darius by his custom-tailored suit jacket, hauling him roughly to his feet. They pulled his arms behind his back, and the harsh metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the dead silent ballroom. Chantel let out a blood-curdling scream and tried to run toward the stage exit, but a female agent intercepted her, smoothly slamming her face first against the floral catering table and securing her wrists in steel cuffs. Beatrice remained on the stage floor, watching her daughter and son-in-law being arrested in front of her entire church congregation and every prominent politician she had invited to show off her wealth. Her carefully curated high society life was gone forever. She looked up at me, her face streaked with ruined makeup, her eyes begging for a mercy she had never once shown me. "Nia, please." Beatrice whimpered, crawling slightly toward my designer stilettos. "I am an old woman. Jamal would not want this. He loved me. I am his mother. Do not do this to his family." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing but cold satisfaction. "You are right about one thing, Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping back into a calm, measured tone. "Jamal did love you. He loved you so much that it blinded him to your toxic, bottomless greed. But he was not stupid. He knew exactly what kind of financial parasite you were." I crouched down slightly so I was at eye level with her. "Let me tell you the final secret of this house," I whispered into the microphone, ensuring the entire room heard her ultimate humiliation. "You thought you were paying Jamal rent every month. You thought you were sending him $2,000 to pay off the debt you owed him for saving you from bankruptcy. You bragged to your country club friends about how responsible you were, paying your own way while complaining about me." Beatrice blinked, her breathing shallow and ragged. "I paid my debt," she sobbed. "I gave him the money every single month on the first of the month." "You did," I confirmed smoothly. "But Jamal never kept a single dime of your money. He knew you were financially reckless. He knew you had drained his father of everything, and he refused to let you drain our family. Do you know where that monthly rent went?" "Beatrice?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks, terrified of the answer. "I set up a specialized, high-yield, educational trust fund for Maya the day she was born," I explained, standing back up to my full height. "Jamal routed every single one of your rent payments directly into that account. You are not paying off a mortgage, Beatrice. For the last 5 years, you have been fully funding your granddaughter college tuition. Your money bought the stocks and bonds that will pay for Maya to attend an Ivy League university." A collective gasp swept through the remaining crowd. The sheer poetic justice of the revelation was staggering. Beatrice had spent years treating Maya like an inconvenience, actively trying to steal her inheritance and throw her onto the street. And all the while, Beatrice had been unknowingly working to build Maya a financial future. You hated my daughter because she represented a threat to your control over Jamal. I said, my voice ringing with undeniable triumph. You called her a mistake. You tried to erase her. But thanks to your monthly contributions, Maya Educational Trust is currently sitting at over $150,000. You basically paid for her future while thinking you were securing your own. Beatrice let out a guttural, agonizing wail. It was the sound of a woman who had just realized that her entire life was a monumental, humiliating joke. She had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and utterly destroyed by the very woman she had spent years relentlessly degrading. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing so violently her shoulders shook. I turned my back on her and looked out over the ballroom. The federal agents were currently marching Darius and Chantel through the center of the crowd. The elite guests watched in silent horror as the two fraudsters were paraded past the ice sculptures and the caviar stations, their hands locked behind their backs. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers parked in the driveway reflected through the massive front windows, casting an eerie glow over the black and white gala. I set the microphone back onto the stand and adjusted my tailored blazer. I had reclaimed my property. I had protected my daughter. I had successfully orchestrated the complete annihilation of the people who tried to destroy my life. The trap had closed perfectly. There was absolutely nothing left for me to do here. The sheriff stepped forward, shining his heavy tactical flashlight across the room, ensuring the guests kept their distance from the federal operation. The local politicians who had posed for photos with Darius just 30 minutes ago were now desperately rushing toward the side exits, shielding their faces from the flashing lights outside. They knew the media would arrive shortly to cover the spectacle of a high society raid. I watched the chaos unfold with absolute tranquility. This was the precise outcome I had engineered from the moment I drove away from this estate 4 weeks ago. Agent Hayes secured the evidence portfolio I had provided, snapping his heavy briefcase shut. "We have everything we need, Mrs. Brooks," he stated respectfully, tipping his head toward me. "The Asset Forfeiture Division will be in touch regarding the frozen funds. We will ensure the corporate accounts of Vanguard Holdings are fully restored by early next week." I nodded my gratitude. "Thank you, Agent Hayes. I appreciate your efficiency in cleaning up this mess." I looked at the two federal officers currently dragging Chantel through the grand foyer. She was thrashing wildly against their grip, her designer heels slipping on the imported oak floors she claimed to own. Darius walked with his head hung in absolute shame, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. I took a deep, steadying breath. The heavy, suffocating weight of my husband's death was still present in my heart, but the toxic burden of his family was officially removed forever. I adjusted the cuffs of my pristine white blazer, feeling the cool air from the open front doors wash over me. The string quartet had completely abandoned their instruments, standing in stunned silence alongside the catering staff. This estate, which had been a fortress of arrogance and cruelty, was finally purged of its corruption. I turned my gaze back to Beatrice, who was still weeping inconsolably on the stage floor, entirely abandoned by the high society friends she had desperately tried to impress. She was completely broken, ruined by her own insatiable greed and toxic pride. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the profound, absolute clarity of justice. My daughter and I were safe, and Vanguard Holdings remained untouchable. I watched the flashing lights of the police cruisers strobing against the glass doors. The federal agents were firmly guiding Darius out into the humid Atlanta night, his head bowed in absolute defeat. But before the female agent could push Chantel through the exit, my sister-in-law suddenly planted her designer heels against the doorframe. With a desperate, violent surge of adrenaline, she wrenched her shoulder free from the agent's grip. She did not run toward the driveway. Instead, she spun around and threw her body forward, dropping heavily onto her knees right at my feet. The impact sent a loud thud echoing across the foyer, her expensive silk dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. "Nia, please!" Chantel screamed, her voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. She tilted her head back, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged rivers. Look at me, Nia. Look at me. We are family. You cannot let them put me in a federal prison. I will not survive in there. Darius made me do it. He lied to me about the money. I am Jamal's blood sister. You loved my brother. You cannot send his only sister to a cage. Have mercy on me, please. I am begging you. The federal agent stepped forward immediately, reaching down to grab Chantel by the elbows. I raised my hand slightly, signaling the agent to pause for just a single moment. I looked down at the woman who had spent the last 10 years making my life a living hell. She was kneeling on the imported Brazilian oak floors she had claimed to own, trembling like a frightened child. There was no trace of the arrogant, entitled socialite who had mocked my career and belittled my daughter. There was only raw, pathetic terror. I stared directly into her tear-filled eyes. My expression remained entirely carved from ice. You threw my daughter's clothes into the street in trash bags, I stated, my voice completely stripped of any human warmth. You watched me walk out into the night with a 6-year-old child on the day we buried her father, and you smiled. You told me I was nothing. You tried to steal the very roof over her head. My mercy went into the garbage with those bags. Get her out of my house. The federal agent did not hesitate. She hauled Chantel forcefully to her feet, ignoring the frantic, guttural screams that tore from my sister-in-law's throat. Chantel thrashed wildly, her expensive heels kicking against the hardwood, but the agent maintained a flawless, unyielding grip. They dragged her through the heavy double doors and out into the blazing lights of the police convoy. The heavy metal doors of the transport van slammed shut instantly, cutting off the sound of her frantic begging. The silence that rushed back into the grand foyer was intoxicating. It was the sound of complete, absolute victory. I turned my attention slowly back toward the ballroom stage. Beatrice was still sitting exactly where I had left her. She looked like a broken porcelain doll, her immaculate black beaded evening gown now covered in dust from the stage floor. Her diamond necklace caught the harsh glare of the remaining event lights, a glittering reminder of the fraudulent wealth she had tried to flaunt. The remaining guests, the politicians, the elite investors, and the church deacons had completely cleared out of the ballroom. They had slipped out through the side doors, desperate to avoid the media cameras that were inevitably gathering just beyond the security gates. Beatrice was entirely alone. The local county sheriff, a tall man with a stern, heavily lined face, stepped forward from the shadows of the ballroom. He adjusted his heavy utility belt and walked methodically toward the stage. His boots clacked loudly against the floor, each step a countdown to her ultimate eviction. He stopped at the edge of the stage and looked down at the ruined matriarch. Mrs. Brooks, the sheriff, announced, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. The federal authorities have executed their warrants for the financial crimes. However, my jurisdiction covers this physical property. The legal documentation provided by Vanguard Holdings proves conclusively that you hold no deed, no lease, and no legal right to occupy this estate. You have been living here under the false pretense of ownership, and you have actively attempted to defraud the actual property owner. Therefore, you are officially trespassing on private corporate property. Beatrice slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were vacant, completely drained of the fierce, toxic arrogance that had defined her entire existence. Trespassing. Beatrice whispered the word, sounding foreign on her tongue. This is my home. My son put me in this home. You cannot throw me out into the street. I am a respected member of this community. I have nowhere else to go. The sheriff crossed his arms over his chest. Your community standing is not my concern, ma'am. The rightful owner of this estate has requested your immediate removal. You have exactly 5 minutes to gather your purse and walk out the front door. If you refuse to comply, I will arrest you for criminal trespassing, and you can join your daughter and son-in-law in a holding cell downtown. The choice is yours. Beatrice looked wildly around the empty ballroom, searching for a single friendly face. She looked toward the foyer, hoping one of her wealthy church friends had stayed behind to offer her a ride or a place to sleep. But the room was completely deserted. The people she had spent thousands of stolen dollars to impress had abandoned her at the first sign of legal trouble. She had built her entire identity on social status, and now that status was utterly annihilated. Her fake wealth was exposed. Her crimes were public knowledge. She was a pariah. She slowly climbed to her feet, her joints popping as she stood. She looked incredibly old, the vibrant energy of her narcissistic delusion completely extinguished. She did not say a word to me. She knew that any attempt to manipulate or guilt-trip me would be entirely useless. She had played her final card and lost everything. She picked up her small designer clutch from a nearby table, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it again. She walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, her beaded gown dragging heavily against the floor. The sheriff followed closely behind her, ensuring she did not attempt to access any other rooms in the house. I watched her pass the massive melting ice sculptures and the abandoned caviar stations. The lavish, over-the-top decorations she had demanded now served as a grotesque monument to her downfall. When she reached the front foyer, she stopped and looked out the open double doors. The driveway was empty save for the police cruisers. Chantel's repossessed Mercedes was gone. Darius's leased sports car had already been impounded by the federal agents as evidence of the fraud. Beatrice had absolutely no transportation. "Where is my car?" Beatrice asked the sheriff, her voice trembling with rising panic. "How am I supposed to leave?" "The federal agents seized the vehicles purchased or leased with fraudulent funds," the sheriff replied bluntly. "You will have to call a cab. I suggest you do it quickly." Beatrice pulled her cell phone from her clutch. Her fingers fumbled awkwardly over the screen as she dialed a local taxi service. She stood on the front porch of the massive estate, shivering slightly in the warm night air. She was wearing a breathtakingly expensive gala gown, dripping in diamonds, yet she had absolutely nowhere to go. She was entirely destitute. I walked out onto the porch and stood a few feet away from her. The floodlights cast long, dramatic shadows across the manicured lawn. I wanted to witness every single second of her departure. I wanted to sear this image into my memory forever. The woman who had tormented me, insulted my career, and tried to steal my daughter's future was now waiting for a cheap taxicab on the curb of my corporate property. A bright yellow cab slowly pulled through the open security gates and drove up the long, winding driveway. It stopped in front of the grand entrance, the exhaust sputtering loudly in the quiet night. The cab driver leaned over and popped the back door open, chewing gum loudly and looking entirely unimpressed by the lavish surroundings. Beatrice did not look back at me. She gathered the heavy fabric of her beaded gown, stepped off the stone porch, and walked toward the idling vehicle. She climbed into the back seat of the cab, pulling the door shut behind her. The driver shifted the car into gear and slowly drove down the driveway, carrying the ruined matriarch away from the estate she had fought so ruthlessly to steal. I watched the red taillights disappear into the Atlanta night, leaving me standing alone on the steps of my fortress. The local sheriff stepped out onto the porch beside me. "The property is officially secure, Mrs. Brooks," he stated, tipping his hat respectfully. "My deputies will remain stationed at the front gate until tomorrow morning to ensure no unauthorized individuals attempt to access the grounds or bother you. The federal team has also cleared the perimeter." "Thank you, Sheriff," I replied, my voice steady and resolute. "I appreciate your assistance tonight." He nodded once and walked down the steps toward his cruiser. I turned around and walked back inside the massive house. The caterers had fled, leaving behind half-empty champagne flutes and plates of untouched food. The silence in the estate was profound, but it was no longer a heavy, oppressive silence. It was a cleansing, beautiful quiet. The toxic presence that had infected these walls for so long was finally gone. I walked through the ballroom and stepped out onto the back terrace. The night air was warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming jasmine. I pulled out my secure phone and dialed Marcus. He answered instantly, the background noise of the federal building echoing behind him. "The property is completely vacated," I informed him, looking out over the dark waters of the estate's private lake. Beatrice was escorted off the premises by the sheriff. "The federal agents have Chantel and Darius in custody. The operation was a flawless success." Marcus let out a loud, triumphant laugh. I just watched them haul Darius into the holding cell. He is already begging for a deal, but the prosecutors are refusing to offer him anything less than the maximum sentence. They are going to make an example out of him. The bank fraud charges alone will put him away for a decade. Ensure the corporate accounts are fully locked down and initiate the asset recovery process in the morning. I commanded my business instincts instantly taking over. I want a full team of contractors at the South Fulton estate by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. We are gutting this entire house. I want every single trace of Beatrice and her horrible aesthetic completely removed from the property. Tear out the Brazilian oak floors, rip down the custom drapes. I want it stripped down to the absolute studs. Understood, Marcus replied smoothly. Are you planning to sell the property once the renovations are complete? No, I said, a slow, genuine smile finally spreading across my face. I have a much better plan for this estate. I am going to turn their fortress of greed into something that actually brings value to this world. Have the legal team draft the paperwork to transfer the deed from Vanguard Holdings into a new nonprofit entity. I hung up the phone and looked back at the sprawling mansion. The battle was officially over. I had protected my daughter, defended my husband's legacy, and utterly annihilated the people who tried to destroy us. The sweet, intoxicating taste of absolute justice lingered in the air. I walked back into the grand foyer, picked up my leather portfolio, and locked the heavy double doors securely behind me. Tomorrow morning, the real work would begin. The past was finally buried, and the future was entirely mine to command. Exactly 1 year passed since that transformative night. 365 days of relentless forward momentum, unburdened by the parasitic weight of Jamal's former family. The criminal justice system moved with a slow, grinding inevitability, but when the hammer finally fell, it shattered their lives completely. The federal trials concluded late last month, wrapping up a highly publicized legal spectacle that captivated Atlanta's elite for weeks. The evidence we presented was so overwhelmingly irrefutable that the defense attorneys barely put up a fight. Darius received a heavy sentence. The federal judge, entirely unamused by his arrogant attempts to blame the corrupt notary and his desperate wife, handed down 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. His crypto empire was exposed as a hollow Ponzi scheme, and his remaining assets were seized to pay restitution to his various victims. He traded his custom-tailored suits and leased sports cars for a standardized orange jumpsuit and a heavily monitored concrete cell. Chantel managed to avoid prison time by accepting a harsh plea deal and turning state's witness against her own husband. Her sentence consisted of 5 years of strict federal probation, thousands of hours of mandatory community service, and a permanent felony record that rendered her completely unemployable in any corporate sector. Without Darius's illicit funds and my stolen property to leverage, her financial reality collapsed instantly. The bank repossessed her hidden Mercedes. Her luxury credit cards were permanently revoked. The creditors seized every single designer bag, diamond necklace, and imported shoes she owned to satisfy her massive consumer debt. Today, Chantel and Beatrice share a cramped 2-bedroom, low-income apartment in a neglected neighborhood far outside the perimeter of their beloved South Fulton. They are entirely destitute. Their spectacular public downfall during the gala ensured their permanent exile from Atlanta high society. The megachurch pastors who used to eagerly accept Beatrice's lavish donations now pretend not to see her when she walks into the sanctuary. The country club socialites who once attended her exclusive brunches blocked her phone number and scrubbed her from their social media feeds. They became absolute pariahs, completely shunned by the very people they sacrificed their morals to impress. They spend their days trapped in a tiny living room, forced to look at each other and acknowledge the sheer magnitude of their colossal failure. They have nothing left but bitter regrets and the crushing reality of their own poverty. I, on the other hand, spent the last 12 months building a monument to genuine empowerment. I stood perfectly still on the manicured front lawn of the South Fulton estate, feeling the warm Georgia sun wash over my shoulders. The property was completely unrecognizable. I had kept my promise to Marcus. The morning after the federal raid, a massive team of elite contractors descended upon the property. We gutted the mansion down to the absolute studs. We ripped out the imported Brazilian oak floors Beatrice cherished so deeply. We tore down the ostentatious crystal chandeliers and smashed the marble countertops. Every single trace of her pretentious toxic aesthetic was physically violently eradicated from the premises. In its place, we built something beautiful, functional, and profoundly meaningful. The dark, heavy walls were replaced with bright, open, concept spaces flooded with natural light. The sprawling, useless formal dining rooms were converted into state-of-the-art computer labs and collaborative workspaces. The oversized master suites were partitioned into comfortable private residential apartments. The extravagant backyard where Beatrice once commanded her caterers now featured a vibrant community garden and a secure, beautifully designed playground. Today was the grand opening. A large, enthusiastic crowd gathered on the front lawn, murmuring with excited anticipation. Local community leaders, prominent philanthropists, and leading financial educators mingled cheerfully in the morning air. A bright red velvet ribbon stretched across the wide front porch, fluttering gently in the breeze. I walked up the freshly paved stone steps, wearing a simple, elegant emerald green dress that reflected life and growth. I did not need a custom power suit today. I was not here to destroy anyone. I was here to heal. I stepped up to the podium positioned just behind the red ribbon. The crowd immediately quieted down, turning their eager attention toward me. I looked out over the sea of supportive, smiling faces and felt an overwhelming sense of profound peace. "Welcome, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly and warmly through the outdoor speakers. Exactly 1 year ago, I stood on this very property and witnessed the darkest aspects of human greed. I saw firsthand how the desperation for wealth and status can completely destroy a family. But I also learned a vital lesson about the true nature of power. Real power is not about hoarding assets or crushing those who stand in your way. Real power is having the absolute capability to change your environment and choosing to use that capability to elevate others. I gestured toward the newly renovated mansion behind me. When my husband Jamal passed away, he left behind a legacy of intense devotion and fierce protection. He spent his life healing physical wounds as a surgeon, and he spent his final days ensuring his daughter and I were financially shielded from harm. Today, we expand that shield to cover those who need it most. It is my absolute honor to officially dedicate this property as the Jamal Center for Women. The crowd erupted into passionate, joyful applause. I smiled, letting the sound wash over me before raising my hand to gently quiet them down. "This estate will no longer serve as a monument to shallow vanity." I continued, my tone ringing with absolute conviction. The Jamal Center for Women is a fully funded transitional housing facility and financial literacy academy for single mothers and recently widowed women facing sudden economic hardship. We will provide secure luxury standard housing while our residents complete comprehensive wealth management courses. We will teach them how to build investment portfolios, negotiate corporate salaries, and escape the crushing cycle of predatory debt. We are giving them the exact tools they need to become the absolute masters of their own financial destinies. Nobody will ever throw these women out into the cold. Nobody will ever trick them with forged documents. They will leave these doors with the knowledge and the capital to build fortresses of their own. I stepped away from the podium and grabbed the oversized silver scissors resting on a velvet cushion nearby. Marcus stood to my right, beaming with profound professional pride. Agent Hayes and Attorney Jenkins were also in the crowd, attending off-duty to witness the positive conclusion of the case they helped build. I positioned the heavy silver blades around the center of the thick red ribbon. To Jamal, I declared loudly, "And to the unstoppable power of women who refuse to be broken." I snapped the scissors shut. The red ribbon severed cleanly, falling away to the stone porch. The crowd erupted into a deafening, jubilant cheer. Joyous music began playing from the outdoor speakers, and the heavy glass doors of the center swung open, inviting the public inside to tour the new facility. I handed the scissors to Marcus and took a deep, liberating breath. The dark, heavy chapter of grief and betrayal was officially permanently closed. I stepped off the porch and walked down onto the lush green lawn. A few yards away, my brilliant, beautiful 6-year-old daughter, Maya, was running happily across the grass. She was chasing a yellow butterfly, her natural curls bouncing in the sunlight, her laughter ringing out clear and bright. She was completely unburdened by the ugly adult drama that had briefly threatened to consume her world. She was safe, deeply loved, and financially secured for the rest of her natural life. Her college tuition was fully funded by the very woman who had tried to discard her. The poetic justice of that fact never failed to bring a genuine smile to my face. I stood there watching her play, feeling the warm sun on my skin. I reflected on the chaotic, brutal journey of the past 12 months. When Beatrice tossed my clothes onto the floor in trash bags, my initial instinct was absolute blinding rage. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear her apart with my bare hands. I wanted to ruin her physical life, but I realized that acting on raw anger is exactly what weak, powerless people do. They lash out because they lack the resources to execute a calculated strategy. The best, most devastating revenge was never about physically destroying my husband's family. It was never about yelling matches or petty social media wars. True revenge was maintaining absolute lethal silence while meticulously assembling an impenetrable legal arsenal. It was about stepping back and letting the cold, unyielding mechanics of federal law handle their insatiable greed. I smiled watching my daughter run and embraced my perfect peace.